So now that you've implemented the ability to browse through products by category, it's time to implement the ability to check out using Stripe. So once you have a product in your cart, this view will allow you to enter in your credit card information, in this case a fake test credit card from Stripe, and pay for your purchase. So this is how this looks in practice. And as you see, checked out successfully and the cart is now empty. Now recall in the REST API chapter, you implemented an API endpoint that enables you to check out by providing a Stripe token, which is either a JSON encoded credit card or a token generated by the Stripe client. In this case, you're going to use a token. But first, in order to implement the checkout functionality, you first need to implement the ability to add a product to your cart. Thus far, you've only enabled users to browse products, not actually add a product to their cart. However, in this example, the Add to Cart button actually does what it's supposed to do. So let's take a look at how this Add to Cart button is implemented. So let's take a look at the HTML code for the product details view. Notice that now there's this Add to Cart directive that's replaced the old placeholder button. So here's the definition of the Add to Cart directive. Let's take a look at the HTML for this directive first, the add to cart.html file. So this HTML should look familiar. It's almost the same code that you saw in previous lessons. So when you click on this button, this add to cart method executes. And when this success variable is set, you get this nice handy added message that informs the user that the product was added to the cart successfully. Now this add to cart controller is responsible for exposing the success variable and the add to cart function to this HTML. Let's take a look at the controller. So here's the add to cart controller. This controller exposes one function, the add to cart function. This is the same function that was glossed over in previous lessons. So recall that the API endpoint for modifying the user's cart allows you to modify the cart however you want on the client side, and then send the whole array over to the server. In this case, you're going to add the specified product with quantity 1 to the array, and then send a put request with the entire array over to the server. You will see this pattern frequently with the mean stack. Rather than exposing separate routes to add and remove an item from the cart, the client code can add, remove, and modify the cart as necessary, and then send the modified array to the server. So now that you have the ability to add a product to your cart, let's define the view in index.js that the users will use to check out. This /checkout route and its corresponding checkout directive will contain all the logic for checking out. So once again, here's the checkout directive's definition. Let's take a look at the HTML, checkout.html first. So there's a fair bit of HTML in the checkout directive. It's broken up into two major parts. The first part, this div with this ng-repeat and the class checkout product, is responsible for updating the cart, because you'd like your users to be able to update the item quantity before finally paying. This HTML corresponds to this part of the page. So again, the HTML does an ng-repeat over all items in the user's cart. Then it displays information about the product like the picture, the name, and the price, and then exposes an input field that lets the user modify the quantity. Now you haven't seen this ng-model directive before either, but conceptually ng-model is pretty simple. It's a two-way binding between the item.quantity property and the value of this input field. So whenever the user updates the input field, AngularJS updates item.quantity appropriately. Also, when the item.quantity property gets updated, AngularJS updates the input field's value accordingly. So once the user is happy with their updates, they can hit this update cart button, and that triggers this update cart function. Let's take a look at the JavaScript code corresponding to the update cart HTML, specifically for the definition of this update cart function. So here's the checkout controller that corresponds to the checkout directive. The cart modification JavaScript is pretty simple. All the cart data is loaded from the API v1me API endpoint. So in order to display the user's cart, all the JavaScript needs to do is pull down the $user service and expose it on the scope. Similarly, to update the cart, all you need to do is make a put request to the correct API endpoint with the entire user object. So now that you've implemented this part for updating your cart, let's take a look at how this credit card checkout functionality is implemented. First, let's see what the HTML looks like in the checkout.html file. So the HTML for the checkout functionality is under this checkout div. In particular, there's this credit card number input that is bound to the Stripe token.number variable using the ng-model directive. Then you also have a button that triggers the checkout function. The checkout function is responsible for charging the credit card with Stripe. Finally, there's these two little messages. The first one shows up when there's an error, and the second one when the user has checked out successfully. Let's take a look at the corresponding controller code. Now, the second half of Checkout Controller is responsible for getting a token from Stripe and submitting it to the server. Stripe has a client-side JavaScript library that takes the user's credit card number and converts it into a one-time use token that you can send to your server, so you don't have to worry about complying with government regulations regarding sending credit cards to your server. In particular, this global Stripe variable that you see here is from Stripe's client-side library. So in the main HTML file, index.html, you're going to need to add this script tag that's going to include Stripe's JavaScript library. Now, this setPublishable_key function allows you to set your client-side JavaScript Stripe key. This key is slightly different from your server-side Stripe API key. The server-side key grants you full access to your Stripe account, and so if a malicious hacker gets hold of it, they could do some real damage. This publishable key is designed to be safe to put in your client-side JavaScript code, because all it enables you to do is convert credit card numbers into Stripe tokens. If somebody scrapes your JavaScript and takes your publishable key, they can't charge your customers or take money from your account. So now the one function that you need to implement is this checkout function. Let's take a closer look at it. So this function is responsible for taking the credit card information, this Stripe token variable, and converting it into a token and then sending it to the server. So once you've set your publishable key, you can then use this createToken function that Stripe gives you to get a Stripe token. And then you're going to send this token over to your REST API. And then once you've succeeded, you can set this checked out property to true, and then your view will display a confirmation message to the user that looks like this down here. So congratulations, you've implemented the checkout functionality for this Mean Retail shopping cart application.